Rogan had come to this place for quiet, for solitude, and for a chance to forget. The only sounds he wanted were the whistle of the wind across rocky dunes, the low hum of solar-driven machinery, and the scrunch of his boots on dry, cracked soil. That was how he had lived for the last 12 weeks, alone, drifting through a harsh land that most people would have classified as uninhabitable. Out here, the horizon ran into a haze of heat and dust, the sky bleached by twin suns that hovered above a desertscape of redstone and loose gravel. There were old stories about how certain mining corporations had once tried to exploit these canyons for rare ore, only to abandon their ventures when storms and shifting terrain consumed their expensive equipment. Rogan had found a few rusted hulls of cargo haulers buried in the dunes. He had even salvaged some parts for his own rover, but mostly he left those decaying machines where they lay, testaments to the futility of trying to conquer this place. He wasn't a miner, or a soldier, or a corporate agent. He was just a man who knew how to survive. The settlement logs listed him as a freelance surveyor, but that was an oversimplification. He had other skills, the kind that made him valuable to certain off-worlders who needed discrete checks on terrain stability, atmospheric data, or geothermal resources. In truth, he was simply someone who had run from his own past and discovered that these endless canyons, battered by dust storms and scorching winds, were far better company than the regrets that haunted him. He rarely dreamed now, and if he did, the nightmares were weaker. That was all he hoped for. He was following a narrow ravine when he heard it, a sound so faint at first that he almost mistook it for the creak of shifting rocks. He paused, lifting his visor slightly to let the desert wind graze his face. There was again a distant quavering cry. Animals made strange noises in these parts, but he'd never heard anything quite like this. It had the unmistakable timbre of pain, high-pitched and desperate. Rogan's entire body tensed. He glanced at the cargo lift strapped to the back of his rover, considered how many hours of daylight were left, then hesitated. This was not his problem. Whatever it was, it could be dangerous, or it could be a simple trap set off by some unsuspecting creature. Yet he could not dismiss the raw desperation in that cry. He tossed aside his first instinct to leave well enough alone. Slowly, he unbuckled his harness from the rover's seat and hopped down into the dust. He followed the sound on foot. It was a risk, leaving the vehicle behind, but the winding gorge would have made navigation by rover nearly impossible anyway. The wind kicked up occasional flurries of sand that stung his cheeks. He clenched his teeth and moved deeper into the canyon. Red-brown rock formations loomed on either side, rising like jagged walls. Their surfaces had been sculpted by centuries of wind erosion, giving them a strangely organic shape. Dust devils swirled across the path. The narrower he went, the louder the sound grew. Before long, he could tell it was some living thing stuck in a trap. He'd seen his share of illegal snares set by poachers or desperate wanderers. Rogan rounded a bend, stepping carefully on loose gravel, and saw a small clearing cradled between two steep outcrops. At first glance, he spotted the steel jaws of a metal snare, some archaic contraption rigged to clamp shut on large wildlife. It had been placed near a crumbled outcropping where smaller animals might attempt to sneak through. Then he saw her, and his breath caught. It was a woman, or rather, a female figure. Yet something about her skin tone, tinted pale violet under the dusty light, made it clear she was not quite human. She wore clothing torn nearly to shreds, and her hair, a color close to a silvery blue, clung to her forehead. Blood ran in dark streaks from the place where the trap had caught her thigh, and from the cuts across her arms, as though she had fought to free herself without success. She made a small, pained sound, the kind that indicated her strength was nearly spent. He didn't think. He rushed over and knelt by her side. The heat radiating from the metal teeth of the trap was intense, possibly from friction or from the relentless sun. She turned her head slightly toward him, eyes clouded with exhaustion, and flinched. Rogan raised his hands, palms up, to show he meant no harm. There was confusion in her gaze, but also a flicker of hope. He recognized that flicker all too well. The last desperate wish that someone might care enough to save you. Her lips parted, but no words came, just a ragged breath. The mechanism looked cruelly efficient. The jaws of the snare had clamped down on her leg above the knee, thankfully not severing it, but causing enough damage to be dangerous. Rogan knew that if he didn't free her soon, she could bleed out or slip into shock. He spoke, quietly, aware that she might not understand. "I'm going to get you out of this," he murmured. "Stay still." He pulled a compact cutting tool from his belt, one with a blade capable of slicing through heavy wires and metal plating. The trap was definitely not brand new. It was half-rusted, probably left here by a poacher months ago, but had done its job. She tried to speak again. This time, what emerged was a series of syllables he didn't recognize, though they were softly melodic. He shook his head to show he didn't understand, then turned back to the trap. Carefully, he bent close, applying the heated blade to one of the hinges. Sparks flew, and the woman let out a sharp gasp when the metal shifted against her wound. Rogan gritted his teeth, pressed harder, and soon one side of the snare released. He tugged it apart, freeing her leg. The sudden motion made her cry out. Fresh blood trickled from the deep gash. Rogan tore a strip from his own spare cloth kit and wrapped her thigh tightly, applying pressure. She was trembling, eyes squeezed shut, her hands balled into fists on the dirt. The hot sun bore down on them mercilessly. "We have to move," he said, though he wasn't sure if she understood. Gently, he slid his arms beneath her, lifting her off the ground. She was surprisingly light, her body slight, as though her bones had a different density. Yet there was a lithe strength in the tension of her muscles. She let out a stifled groan, then fell silent, barely conscious. Rogan could feel her blood seeping through the cloth already. He tried not to think about how quickly infection could set in, how many hours or days it might take before her leg began to deteriorate. He only knew that leaving her was not an option. One glance at the battered mechanical trap told him someone had placed it deliberately. Maybe they'd meant to catch local wildlife. Maybe they wanted something else. He retraced his steps, carrying her, scanning the heights of the canyon for any sign of watchers. The wind carried dust and grit, stinging his eyes. If the poachers were around, they might not appreciate someone messing with their snare. But no one appeared. At last, he reached his rover, a squat vehicle with protective plating and a makeshift canopy overhead. He carefully set her in the passenger's seat, adjusting the seat's angle so she could lie back without undue pressure on her injuries. Her head rolled to the side. Sweat shone on her brow, and her breathing was shallow. He quickly checked her pulse. It was too fast. He needed to treat her now. He had some medical supplies in the storage compartment, enough to handle moderate wounds, but alien biology was another story. Still, blood was blood, and a wound was a wound. He'd do what he could. He unwrapped the soaked bandage from her leg, wincing at the jagged edges of torn flesh. She jerked slightly when he swabbed antiseptic along the gash. Her lips tightened, but she made no sound. Then, in a voice so soft it nearly vanished in the desert wind, she whispered something. He paused. Her eyelids fluttered open. They were a startling shade of pale gold, shot through with flecks of green. She tried to form words in the common human tongue. "Hurt bad," she managed, accent heavy. Rogan nodded. "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry." He did his best to bind the wound, applying a sealing foam designed to close deep lacerations. It hissed against her skin, and she recoiled at the sting, but otherwise stayed still. Her breathing was ragged by the time he finished. He turned on the rover's limited climate control, letting a cooler current wash over them. The woman sagged into the seat, eyes closed, murmuring faintly in her own language. Rogan let her rest. He checked the horizon. The sun was still high, but a haze of swirling dust hinted at a possible storm in the distance. He frowned. Storms here could tear a rover apart if you weren't prepared. He had a more permanent shelter a few kilometers away, a portable station that he'd been using as a base. That was where he needed to take her. It would be safer than this open desert. And if there were people hunting her, he needed walls between them and her. He started up the engine. Its low hum reverberated through the metal plating, and he steered them out of the canyon. The heat pressed down like a leaden blanket. He kept glancing over at her, noticing how her chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, how the lines of strain never left her face. At one point, her eyes half opened, and she asked in a broken whisper, "Why, you help?" He didn't know how to answer. Maybe it was guilt or leftover morality from a life he'd tried to bury. Maybe it was because, in her eyes, he saw a reflection of the same loneliness he carried in himself. "Because I can," he said simply. She didn't respond, merely drifted back into a state of uneasy unconsciousness. They arrived at a station just as the winds began to pick up. The station was little more than a prefabricated shelter made of durable composite, anchored against a rock face. Rogan parked the rover under a crude awning he'd pieced together from salvage. The air was tinted orange by swirling dust. He hurried around to the passenger side, gently lifting the woman into his arms again. She stirred, letting out a pain moan. "It's okay," he murmured. "I've got you." With careful steps, he carried her inside. The station's automated system recognized his ID tag and cycled the airlock, pulling in the stale desert breeze and flushing it through filters. Inside, the lights were dim but functional, casting a bluish glow on metal walls. It wasn't luxurious, just a bunk, a small cooking unit, a storage locker, and a corner that served as a workbench. But it would do. He laid her on the bunk, then set about checking her injuries in better conditions. She was conscious enough to wince when he peeled away the temporary bandage and sprayed a more thorough antiseptic. Her skin tone was indeed unusual, a soft violet that deepened around her wrists and neck. The dryness of the desert had caused shallow cracks in her skin near her knuckles, something that implied she might be adapted to a more humid environment. Rogan worked methodically, focusing on cleaning the wound, ensuring no grit remained, then applying a fresh seal and bandage. Her leg would need rest if it was to heal properly, but at least the bleeding had mostly stopped. He moved to the small supply cabinet and found a hydration pouch, rigged it into a stand, and inserted a thin needle into a vein on her arm. She let out a faint whimper, but didn't resist. "I can't guarantee this is perfect for you," he explained, "but it should stabilize you until I figure out something better." She nodded weakly, her eyes flickering. Then she drifted into a restless sleep. Rogan exhaled, stepping back to watch her. She was an enigma. He wondered about her story. Was she from a different star system? Or was she part of some reclusive group that had colonized this planet long ago? Whatever her origin, she was now under his care, and that alone gave him more purpose than he'd felt in a long time. He spent the next hour checking the perimeter, ensuring the storm shutters were locked in place. Sand pelted the exterior with a relentless hiss. Occasionally, the wind would rattle the station's panels, making him worry about the structural integrity. He'd been through these storms before, but they were never pleasant. Usually, he just holed up inside and waited it out, listening to the howling emptiness outside. This time, however, he had a patient. He set out a few more medical supplies near the bunk, arranged water flasks and ration packs, and made sure the lights were steady. The last thing he needed was a power outage. As night approached, the desert outside dimmed from blazing orange to a brooding red, then to a near black littered with swirling shadows. The storms on this planet rarely brought rain, only lashing winds and dust that could scour paint from metal in a few days. He checked the readings on the small console near the door. The wind speeds were climbing, likely to peak after midnight. Perfect. He turned his attention back to his uninvited guest. She was breathing more evenly now. Curiosity tugged at him, but he refused to pry. She deserved privacy. Nonetheless, he spotted a small metallic band around her neck, like a necklace, but with embedded circuitry. Possibly a translation device, or maybe something else. He had to resist the urge to examine it while she slept. A few hours later, she stirred, blinking as she gazed around. The overhead light caught the reflection in her eyes, making them gleam like molten gold. She drew in a sharp breath when she tried to move her leg. "Hurts," she mumbled. Rogan, who had been tinkering with some old data chips, stood and approached her carefully. "Yes, it's going to hurt for a while. You lost a lot of blood. I've stabilized the wound, but you need rest." She nodded, swallowing. "Thank you." Her voice was low, husky, with a certain tremor that hinted at vulnerability. He offered her a small metal cup. Drink. It's just purified water. She took it, her hands shaking slightly. When she sipped, a soft sigh escaped her lips, relief maybe, or gratitude. They sat in silence for a while. The only background noise the hum of the station's filters and the storm's roar outside. Finally, he ventured a question. Can you tell me your name? She opened her mouth, hesitated, then said, Eris. The words sounded both foreign and lyrical. I'm Rogan, he said, placing a hand on his chest, then gesturing to her. Eris, she repeated, nodding. Rogan. She attempted a faint smile. Sorry. Common language, not strong. He gave a small nod of understanding. You're doing fine. Her gaze flicked around, taking in the cramped surroundings. Where am I? She asked haltingly. Just a shelter, he replied. My makeshift home on this planet. You were caught in a trap. I found you, brought you here. She closed her eyes briefly, as though remembering the agony of the snare. Poachers, she whispered. They hunt me. He leaned forward. Why would they do that? Her brows furrowed, and she spoke with more difficulty, as though trying to mold words that were unfamiliar on her tongue. I escaped my assignment. They want my knowledge. She frowned, frustration evident. Hard to explain in your tongue. Rogan let the question hang. He didn't push. He recognized the raw fear behind her words. Instead, he simply said, You're safe here for now. The relief in her eyes was immediate, though it was tinged with the ghost of lingering doubt. Over the next day, the storm outside raged. Metallic groans reverberated as the wind tested every seam of the station. Sometimes a gust slammed into the walls so fiercely that Eris startled, pain flashing across her face when she tensed her injured leg. Rogan would help her sit up, offer her water, check the bandage. He was no doctor, but he'd treated enough injuries in his life to handle the basics. Whenever she was lucid enough, they tried to communicate. He learned bits and pieces. She wasn't a local, but had come to this planet on some research mission. She had parted ways with her group, or perhaps been left behind. She alluded to a memory of an attack, of infiltration, then stumbling into the desert alone. How exactly she ended up in that snare was still unclear. Eventually, the storm receded, leaving a battered landscape. Sand drifts had rearranged themselves in tall ridges, half burying the rover's wheels. The air was thick with fine dust that glittered under the harsh sunlight. Rogan woke that morning to find Eris sleeping more peacefully, her bandage free of new blood. He quietly stepped outside to check the damage, clearing sand from the rover's intake ports and scraping it off the canopy. A sense of eerie calm suffused the desert. Sometimes, after the worst storms, the sky would lighten for a few hours, as though granting a brief reprieve before the next onslaught. He felt a small knot of anxiety tighten in his chest, remembering Eris's halting words about poachers. If they had set that trap, they might still be in the area. He was hosing dust off the rover's solar panels when a faint sound made him freeze. It was the crack of a distant rifle shot. The noise echoed strangely in the canyons, making it difficult to pinpoint. He scanned the horizon, shading his eyes against the glare. Nothing moved except a swirl of dust near a jagged spire of rock. Either that shot was a trick of the wind, or was a sign that others were out there, armed. Quickly, he finished brushing the panels, then ducked back inside the station. Eris was propped up on an elbow, eyes wide. I heard something, she said, voice trembling. Sound of gun. He nodded, moving to the small corner where he stored his own weapons. He wasn't proud of how well-armed he was, but a place like this demanded it. Could be, he answered. He checked the charge on a compact pulse rifle, glancing at her over his shoulder. We might need to move soon. If you can't walk, I'll help you. She swallowed hard, her fingers clenching the blanket. Leg still hurts, but better. I can try. The lines of pain etched in her face worried him, but he saw the resolve in her eyes. They spent the next hour getting ready. Rogan scrounged supplies, water, protein rations, portable medical kits, and a portable communications device that sometimes linked to satellites overhead when those satellites were in range. Eris insisted on walking a few steps, wincing but managing to stay upright. She had a slight limp, and the bandage around her thigh was bulky, but the worst bleeding had stopped. By midday, they were loading the rover, setting out into the desert in search of a more secure location. Rogan had a vague plan. There was an old communications relay station about 20 kilometers away near a mountainous ridge. If it was still intact, they might be able to send a distress signal or at least figure out what was happening in the region. The journey wasn't easy. The rover's treads struggled with shifting dunes left behind by the storm. Eris, pale and drawn, clutched the seat whenever the vehicle lurched over uneven terrain. She occasionally let out a soft hiss of pain, refusing any further medication for fear it would make her too drowsy. Each time he offered to turn around and go back to the shelter, she shook her head vehemently. "Not safe," she insisted. "They will find me." The conviction in her voice left him no doubt that these pursuers were a real threat. They pressed on, weaving through a canyon with red stone walls that soared overhead. The midday sun scorched them, yet inside the rover's cabin, at least they had minimal cooling from the battered climate unit. Rogan kept an eye on the rocky ledges above, half expecting to see silhouettes of armed figures. The wind carried the faint smell of ozone. Far to the west, dark clouds hinted at another storm system, though it might not reach them for a day or two. He was acutely aware of time slipping away. Eris needed real medical care if her wound worsened. But in this forsaken land, that care was unlikely to come from the standard channels. They made camp that night in a shallow crevice, with just enough of a rock overhang to shield them from swirling grit. Rogan set up a portable heat shield, which radiated a small circle of warmth once the temperature plummeted. The nights here were as cold as the days were hot, and Eris shook under her thin blanket. He draped an extra thermal cloth over her shoulders and tried not to stare at the graceful lines of her collarbones, the faint luminescence in her skin's undertones. She caught his gaze and offered a slight, shy smile. "I know I look different," she said softly. He cleared his throat, shaking his head. "No, it's not that. I'm just—" He paused, uncertain how to finish that thought. Intrigued? Curious? Strangely comforted? "I'm just making sure you're warm enough." She lowered her gaze, fiddling with the metal band around her neck. "It's better. Thank you." A hush settled between them, broken only by the hiss of wind scraping sand against rock. Then she looked up again. "You run from something too?" she asked in halting words. He felt a pang in his chest. "Why do you say that?" She tilted her head. "Your eyes like you lose something or someone." Rogan swallowed. He couldn't recall the last time he'd spoken about his past. Usually, he kept it buried. "My brother died," he finally said, voice tight. "It was my fault. At least, that's how it felt. I couldn't save him, so I left everything behind. Figured it was easier to just be alone." He realized how stark it sounded once the words were out. Silence lingered, thick and potent, until Eris reached out and rested her fingers lightly on his forearm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Her eyes glistened with genuine empathy. He had no words, only a shaking nod of acknowledgement. They curled up on either side of the small heat shield, neither quite willing to say more. The desert sky overhead gleamed with stars, far more vivid than any sky Rogan had seen on heavily populated worlds. Out here, the cosmos felt close enough to touch. Now and then, Eris let slip a word in her own language, as though speaking to herself. He wondered what her homeworld looked like. Perhaps she stared at these alien stars, longing for a place she might never see again. Morning came with a searing sun and an unsettling hush. They set out again, the rover grinding over ridges and slopes. Each hour that passed, Eris grew more anxious, scanning the horizon with wary eyes. Rogan noticed the tension in her posture. He occasionally offered reassurance. "We'll find that relay station. Maybe we'll get a message out," he said, even though he had little faith in outside help. Sometimes, no help came at all. Halfway through the day, they encountered an unexpected obstacle, a scattering of twisted metal that might have once been a small skimmer or scout craft. It lay half buried in sand, broken in two. Eris stiffened, pointing. "That belongs to them," she said, voice trembling. Rogan slowed the rover, scanning the debris. "The ones who hunted you?" She nodded. "Yes. They had small ships to cover ground. Maybe a storm took this one. Rogan could see signs of a crash, scorched edges, twisted support beams. No bodies in sight. He disembarked, rifle at the ready, and approached the wreck with caution. It was silent except for the faint clatter of loose panels flapping in the breeze. He found empty crates, some ration packs, and footprints in the sand leading away toward the east. Whoever was here had left. He returned to the rover. Eris's face was ashen. "They're close," she murmured. "We must hurry." Rogan agreed. He didn't like the idea of being cornered out in the open. The more he thought about it, the more he suspected that her hunters weren't just random outlaws. The gear he'd seen looked high-grade, the kind used by well-funded groups. That trap she'd been caught in, though, seemed more primitive. Unless it was something they'd improvised, or maybe they'd placed multiple types of traps across the region. Either way, the sense of impending danger tightened in his gut. By late afternoon, the land rose into a slope of cracked stone, and they caught a glimpse of the old relay station perched on a ridge. It was a squat tower, half collapsed, with a metal dish angled skyward. Rogan could almost imagine how it had once served as a link in the chain of communications across this planet. Now it was abandoned, left to decay when the corporations had pulled out. He parked the rover near an outcropping of rock, hoping to camouflage it somewhat. Eris grimaced as she climbed out, favoring her injured leg. He offered his shoulder, and she leaned on him gratefully, each step shaky but determined. The station's entrance was jammed partially open, debris blocking half of the doorway. Rogan used a small pry bar to force a gap. They slipped inside, flashlights illuminating a corridor strewn with old cables, collapsed ceiling panels, and dusty consoles. The musty odor of disuse clung to every surface. "If we're lucky," Rogan said quietly, "we can power up the main console. Maybe send a pulse signal or something." Eris nodded, her gaze darting nervously around. "We must do it quick," she said. "They could come any time." In a larger chamber, they found the primary control desk. The panels were dead, the power lines likely corroded. Rogan, who had rewired plenty of broken tech in his time, set to work methodically, prying open an access hatch and examining the tangle of cables. "Hand me that toolkit," he said, glancing at Eris. She obliged, sliding it across the floor. He identified the main power coupling and tested a small portable battery he'd brought, hooking it to the station's input. Nothing at first. Then a weak glow flickered across one of the monitors. A hum resounded through the tower, followed by static from an overhead speaker. Eris inhaled sharply, hope flashing in her eyes. Rogan typed on a corroded keypad, bypassing old security lines. The screen flickered, lines of code scrolling. At last, it stabilized enough for him to attempt a short-range broadcast. "This is a distress call," he said, voice echoing in the hollow space. "Coordinates attached. Any friendly receiver, respond." Static crackled in reply. He tried again, adjusting frequencies. No immediate answer. He exhaled, turning to Eris. "Sometimes the satellites rotate out of range. We'll keep trying." She gave a tired nod. Before they could do much else, a shot rang out, striking the wall near the console. Sparks flew, and Eris let out a cry, ducking behind the control desk. Rogan cursed, dropping to a crouch. A second shot reverberated. The muzzle flash came from the entry corridor behind them. "They found us," Eris whispered, voice trembling. Rogan clenched his jaw, gripping his rifle. "Stay down." He popped up, returning fire. The corridor flashed with pulses of light as energy blasts ricocheted. He caught sight of two figures in streamlined gear hugging the walls. They wore face masks tinted red, probably with built-in filters. Skilled, well-armed. Perfect. Eris scrambled toward a fallen piece of machinery, using it for cover. Her legs still hampered her movement, but adrenaline kept her going. Rogan motioned for her to stay put, then fired a few more rounds, driving the attackers to retreat momentarily behind a collapsed bulkhead. He could hear faint chatter from them, rapid and tense. They were coordinating. He switched positions, creeping along the edge of the room, scanning for a flank route. One of the attackers tossed something, a small metallic sphere. "Grenade!" Rogan shouted. He dove behind a console, yanking Eris with him. The blast rattled the chamber, sending fragments and dust raining down. A cloud of smoke billowed. He coughed, eyes burning. Out of the haze, one figure rushed forward, weapon raised. Rogan fired blindly, the shot zipping past the intruder's shoulder. The figure slammed into him, driving the butt of a rifle toward his face. Rogan blocked with a forearm, grunting at the jolt of pain. They grappled in close quarters, feet slipping on rubble. Rogan managed to twist free, elbowing the attacker in the side, then swung his rifle up. A single shot tore through the intruder's chest armor. The man, or woman, collapsed with a choked cry. In the swirling dust, Rogan spotted the other attacker, skirting the far side of the chamber, heading for Eris. "No!" he shouted, lunging forward. Eris tried to scramble away, but her injuries slowed her. The attacker aimed a pistol at her head. Rogan fired. The beam hit the attacker's weapon, knocking it aside. With a snarl, the attacker kicked Eris's wounded leg, and she shrieked, collapsing. She curled on the floor, clutching her thigh, blood seeping through the bandage anew. Rogan roared, tackling the attacker from behind. They crashed into a half-broken console, metal shards slicing Rogan's arm. With desperate force, he pinned the attacker's weapon hand to the deck and pulled the trigger of his own rifle. The attacker went limp, breath rasping, then lay still. Rogan panted, ears ringing, every muscle trembling with adrenaline. Smoke drifted around them, carrying the acrid scent of burnt circuits. He turned to Eris, who was gasping in pain, tears streaking her dust-covered cheeks. Her eyes were filled with panic. He knelt beside her, pressing a hand to her bleeding wound. "Stay with me," he urged. Her eyes fluttered. "More coming," she whispered. Rogan glanced at the corridor. Any others would have heard the commotion. They had to get out. But first, he had to stabilize her. Again, he tore off a piece of cloth, tying it tightly above the wound to slow the bleeding. She clenched her jaw, tears gathering. "I'm sorry," he murmured, hating the agony in her face. "Let's go." They staggered through the station's corridors, searching for another exit. The building shuddered under structural damage. That grenade had compromised the walls. On the far side, they found a hatch that led to an exterior ladder. Rogan shoved it open, sand pouring in. He helped Eris climb, wincing at her labored breathing. Every rung seemed an ordeal, but she kept going, steeled by survival instinct. They emerged on a rocky ledge near the tower's rusted dish. From here, they could see the surrounding canyons, the rover far below. The vantage point also showed movement in the distance, several figures on foot, heading their way. Likely more of the hunters. Rogan felt hopelessness coil in his gut. They were outnumbered, Eris was wounded, and there was nowhere to hide in this precarious position. The only option was to scramble down the rocky slope behind the tower, a steep path that would be treacherous even in perfect conditions. He guided Eris down, half carrying her. Loose stones gave way, each step threatening to spill them into a ravine. Meanwhile, the voices of their pursuers drifted upward. At one point, a shot whizzed past them, chipping the rock near Eris's foot. They hastened their pace, hearts pounding. Finally, they made it to the bottom, landing in a dusty gulch. They ducked behind a large boulder, panting. Rogan peered around the corner. 3 pursuers, carrying rifles, scanning the ravine. Another shot cracked against the boulder, forcing him to jerk back. Eris clutched her leg, breathing shallowly. "Rogan," she whispered, eyes wide. He recognized the fear, the sense that this might be their end. He realized they had only one advantage, the rover. If they could reach it, they might outmaneuver the hunters, even if their speed was compromised. "Stay close," he whispered, offering her his shoulder again. She nodded, sweat beading on her forehead. They inched along the gulch, using boulders for cover. The pursuers spread out above, searching. Rogan's heart hammered. If one of them looked down at the right angle, they'd see them. Then it happened. A shot rang out, splintering the rock near Rogan's head. He cursed, returning fire blindly. "Run!" he shouted, practically dragging Eris forward. She stumbled but pushed on, teeth gritted. Bullets or energy beams slammed into the rocks around them, raising clouds of stone dust. Desperate, they sprinted for the rover's position. Rogan's lungs burned. Ahead, the vehicle was partially hidden behind a jutting pillar of rock. He fumbled for the remote key in his pocket, pressing it. The rover beeped, unlocking. Eris cried out as her foot caught on uneven ground, almost collapsing. Rogan caught her around the waist, hauling her upright. Another shot rattled the ground. He squeezed off a few rounds behind him, forcing the pursuers to dive for cover. Then they made it to the rover. He half-lifted, half-pushed Eris into the passenger seat. He leaped behind the controls, jammed the ignition. The engine roared to life. Before the hunters could close in, he gunned the throttle, the rover lurching forward in a spray of sand. A red beam slammed into the rear plating, scorching it. Eris screamed, ducking low. Rogan spun the wheel, navigating a precarious slope. The rover jolted and slid, but it stayed upright. For a breathless minute, he thought they'd tip over. Then the treads caught, and they tore around a bend in the canyon, out of the direct line of fire. His chest heaved. Eris was clutching the seat, her face twisted with pain. A distant echo of gunfire faded behind them. They had escaped, at least for now. They didn't slow until they'd put several kilometers between themselves and the station. The sky above glimmered with impending dusk, the desert turning a burnt orange. Rogan finally let the rover idle, scanning for any sign of pursuit. Nothing. He exhaled heavily, every muscle shaking from tension. Eris looked at him, eyes filled with gratitude, but her lips trembled. "I'm sorry," she said, tears leaking down her cheeks. "I bring you trouble." He shook his head. "No, you didn't ask to be hunted. Don't apologize." They found a small outcropping to use as shelter for the night. The rover's sensors indicated a calmer forecast. No major storm at least. Rogan helped Eris out of the passenger seat, laying her on a makeshift bedroll. Her bandage was soaked again, the wound reopened from all the exertion. He removed the old dressing and applied fresh antibiotic gel in a tighter wrap. This time, she couldn't hold back a sob when he touched the raw flesh. "I'm sorry," he whispered, wishing he had better means to help her. She took shallow breaths, tears sliding down her dusty cheeks. "It's okay. You keep me alive." He wanted to say something comforting, but words failed him. Instead, he gently brushed her hair away from her forehead, noticing again the faint glow in her skin where the overhead glare touched it. She closed her eyes, exhaustion overwhelming her. Rogan sat beside her, checking his rifle's charge, scanning the horizon for movement. The sun slipped lower, painting the desert in vivid streaks of crimson and gold. In another life, he might have seen this as beautiful. Now, it felt like the final light before darkness swallowed them. Eris stirred after some minutes, her voice weak. "Where will we go?" He clenched his jaw, recalling their near-death encounter at the station. "We can't rely on that place anymore. It's compromised." He thought of a rumor he'd heard from old prospectors, an abandoned supply outpost far to the north. It might have half-intact defenses, or at least walls. "There's a place up north," he said quietly. "It's not on every map. If we can reach it, we might stand a better chance." She nodded. "Yes, anywhere safer than here." That night, they slept in uneasy shifts, each haunted by footsteps that might come from beyond the stony crags. But no one appeared. The next morning, they set out early, heading toward the rumored outpost. The journey would take days if Eris's condition didn't improve. As the rover crested dune after dune, Rogan tried to keep an eye on her. She was pale, but she forced herself to sit upright, scanning the landscape. Sometimes she spoke in her language, catching herself, then correcting into broken common. They fell into a strained routine. Rogan drove, keeping watch for signs of pursuit, while Eris dozed fitfully, still in pain. They had to ration water carefully. Daytime heat soared, the twin suns beating down, and Eris's injuries required constant hydration. Once, when they stopped to cool the rover's overheating engine, Rogan found a few wilted desert plants that stored moisture in their stems. He crushed some of the pulp for her to drink. She managed a grateful smile. "You know these lands well," she said. He shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Well enough not to die." She placed a hand over his. I owe you my life, many times over. He looked away, a flush creeping into his cheeks. Let's just get through this, he murmured. On the second day, they encountered more wreckage. This time, a larger craft, possibly once in her transport, lying on its side, half buried in shifting sands. Rogan guided the rover close, hoping to scavenge additional supplies. Inside, battered crates revealed only scraps of metal and a few stale rations. Eris found a small medical injector labeled with an unfamiliar script. She scanned the symbols with her necklace device, which apparently had some partial translation function. This might help with infection, she said. Rogan hesitated, uncertain of the dosage or side effects, but Eris's condition was not improving. In the end, they administered a small dose. Over the next hours, the redness around her wound subsided, and some color returned to her face. By the third day, her limp was less pronounced, though she still moved gingerly. Rogan felt a stirring of hope that maybe she would fully heal. Each night, they slept in the open or under minimal shelter, always on alert. Tension wove them together in an odd closeness. Eris often reached out to him, resting a hand on his shoulder or letting their fingers brush. He found himself wanting that contact, craving the reassurance that he wasn't alone, that this wasn't all a hopeless fight against a merciless desert and relentless hunters. She spoke more about her past, in fragments, how she had belonged to a team studying energy anomalies, how a faction wanted to exploit those discoveries for weapons, how she refused and found herself labeled a traitor or a loose end to eliminate. Rogan listened, forging the puzzle pieces in his mind. It made sense that well-funded mercenaries were after her. Her knowledge could be worth fortunes on black markets. He didn't judge her. He just quietly resolved to protect her, though he wasn't sure why. Perhaps because saving her felt like atonement for failing his brother. Or perhaps because every time she looked at him with those luminous eyes, he felt something he thought he'd never feel again. On the dawn of the fourth day, they finally sighted a series of low buildings crouched between a steep cliff and the yawning mouth of a canyon. Rogan's chest tightened. This had to be the outpost. It looked abandoned, the walls chipped and partially collapsed, but some structures remained upright. They parked near an old docking platform. Everything was silent except for the sigh of the wind. Eris glanced at him. "We made it." He nodded. "Yeah, I think so." They scouted the perimeter, rifles raised. No movement, no signs of recent occupation. Inside the largest building, they found old bunks, half covered in dust, and a generator station that might still function if they repaired it. The roof had holes, but it seemed stable enough. Eris exhaled shakily, sinking onto a crate. "A roof, real walls," she said, tears of relief in her eyes. Rogan reached out, gently brushing his fingertips across her cheek. She leaned into his touch. "We're safe for a little while," he said, though in the back of his mind, he knew that safety was never guaranteed. They spent the next few days patching up the outpost as best they could. Rogan cleaned the generator, replaced fuses, and eventually coaxed it into a low hum of functionality. They managed to get a few lights on, to Eris's delight. She used her knowledge of scanning equipment to rig a basic perimeter alarm. If anyone approached, they'd know. During the evenings, they ate simple rations together, comparing words in her language with the common tongue, finding ways to communicate more clearly. Slowly, she regained strength, able to move about without wincing every few steps. On a crisp morning, when the sky glowed a fragile pink, Rogan found her standing at the edge of the canyon, staring out at the vast emptiness. "What are you thinking?" he asked, stepping up beside her. She turned, eyes luminous. "That I never expected to survive long enough to see this place, to see any place." She paused, a slight tremble in her voice. "I thought I'd bleed out in that trap. But you came." He swallowed, memories of that day flooding back. "Yeah," was all he could manage. She tilted her head. "Why did you come, Rogan?" Her voice held genuine curiosity, free of accusation. He looked down at his calloused hands, recalling the guilt, the longing to do something good. "I couldn't let another life slip away when I could stop it," he said simply. "Even if I didn't realize it at the time, I think I needed to save someone. Maybe for myself, as much as for you. Her expression softened, and in a quiet moment that felt suspended in time, she stepped closer, sliding her arms around him. He hesitated only an instant before returning her embrace. The warmth of her body, the gentle pressure of her forehead against his chest, it felt like acceptance or forgiveness. For the first time, he allowed himself to exhale the burden he'd carried. Out here, on a forsaken planet under twin suns, he found something that felt like redemption. They settled into a fragile peace. Each day, they fortified the outpost a bit more, patched walls, scavenged metal plates to reinforce windows. They took inventory of rations. Eris spent time scanning the frequencies, trying to see if any transmissions might be from friendly sources. Usually, she only picked up faint static or bursts of coded chatter that might belong to the hunters. Rogan patrolled with a watchful eye, rifle always near at hand. One evening, as they ate a meager dinner of dried grains boiled in water, Eris asked, "If your brother were here, do you think he'd be proud of you?" The question caught him off guard, and he nearly choked on his food. He set his spoon down, clearing his throat. "I don't know," he admitted. "I used to think he'd blame me for not saving him. But maybe now, seeing what I've done for you, he'd understand that I'm trying to make amends." Eris reached across the makeshift table, covering his hand with hers. "He would be," she said softly. "You have a good heart, Rogan." Her words glowed in his chest, chasing away some of the darkness that had lingered there. He found himself taking her hand in his, gently lacing their fingers. She smiled, and for the first time since this ordeal began, he allowed himself to believe that there might be a future beyond running and hiding. That maybe, just maybe, the two of them could build something lasting on this desolate world or beyond it. When the next storm finally swept across the desert, they stayed inside, the outpost walls buffeted by winds that roared like a beast outside. But this time, they weren't alone, trembling in separate corners. They huddled together, warm under a salvaged blanket, listening to the cacophony. She told him stories from her home. Crystalline lakes under skies with 3 moons, temples where her people sang resonant hymns to the cosmos. He told her about his childhood on a mining colony, how he and his brother used to dream about flying off to see the galaxy. In each other's stories, they found reflections of wonder and regret, of hope and heartbreak, weaving them closer. When the storm abated, they ventured outside to find the desert rearranged yet again. Dunes had shifted, rocks had toppled, but the outpost still stood. No sign of the hunters. Days turned into a week, then 2, and not a single hostile figure came prowling. Rogan wondered if perhaps the group had written them off, or if the mercenaries had bigger priorities elsewhere. A part of him feared a sudden assault, but day after day, the alarms remained silent. Eris's leg healed enough that she could walk smoothly again, though she carried a slight scar as a reminder. One evening, as the suns dipped low, painting the sky in golden rose, they stood on the outpost's improvised ramparts. A hush enveloped the land, as though it too had grown tired of violence. She turned to him, something bright in her eyes. "I never imagined I'd find peace in a place like this," she said, her voice catching. He rested a hand on her arm. "Me neither." They had no official declaration, no ceremony, but it was clear they had chosen each other. Eris admitted she could no longer return to her old life. It would mean facing her superiors, her persecutors, or going back to a system that might punish her. Rogan confessed he had no ties left to the world he'd fled. Their only question was whether they dared to remain on this desert planet, forging a life in the hidden outpost, or if they should attempt to find a ship off-world. In the end, they decided to stay. At least for now. The desert, harsh as it was, had become their refuge, the place where they had saved each other. One by one, the nights rolled on, and with each dawn, they woke to the knowledge that they were, improbably, alive and together. That knowledge lit a small, steady flame inside Rogan, one he never thought he would feel again. Sometimes, they would go for hours without speaking, comfortable in shared silence, his hands working on some repair, her fingers deftly adjusting scanning equipment. Other times, they laughed, discovering pockets of humor in their mismatched backgrounds. The fear that had once gripped them slowly receded. Of course, it never disappeared entirely. They still kept watch, still braced themselves whenever they heard a distant echo that might be gunfire. But they faced it side by side. Late one night, after a simple meal, Eris set down her cup and looked at Rogan with a serene intensity. "You saved me from that trap," she said, voice soft yet unwavering. "But you also freed me from everything I was running from. I didn't expect to find this." He sat next to her on the floor, their backs against a stack of crates. "Me neither," he admitted. "I came here to lose myself. I never guessed I'd find someone worth living for." She leaned in, pressing her forehead to his. He felt her warmth, breathed in the faint scent of desert and ozone that clung to her. In that moment, the swirl of doubts, regrets, and guilt that had shadowed his life felt distant, replaced by the presence of this remarkable being who trusted him enough to stand by his side. Slowly, gently, they closed the small distance between them, lips meeting in a tender kiss that carried all the fragility and promise of a new beginning. The next morning, they stood together at the outpost's entrance, watching the sun rise over the dunes. A new day spilled across the rocks, gold and fierce and beautiful. Eris slipped her hand into his. He squeezed it, feeling the steady beat of her pulse. He no longer thought only of the memories that had haunted him. Now, he thought of how they would fix the roof, how they might cultivate a hidden garden if they could find the right seeds, how they'd watch the stars at night without dread. He thought of how she laughed when he tried to speak her language, how her eyes lit with wonder whenever they discovered something unexpected in this rugged land. They walked a short distance to survey the surroundings, checking for any fresh tracks. Nothing. The place felt abandoned except for the two of them, as though the desert itself had chosen to shield them. Eris turned, gazing at him with a small, hopeful smile. "This can be home," she said softly, as if the idea still stunned her. Rogan nodded, brushing a hand across her cheek. "Yes," he answered. "Home." They lingered there, letting the warmth of the dawn settle over them. The desert winds might bring hardships, and the threat of old enemies might still lurk in unseen corners of the wasteland, but they had chosen to face those possibilities together. Behind them, the outpost stood silent, but no longer empty. Within its patched walls and humming generator, it housed two survivors who had found each other in the midst of a hostile world. Their journey had begun with a scream, a trap, and an unlikely rescue. Now, it continued with a shared resolve to build a life where neither had believed one was possible. They had discovered that beneath the surface of violence and desperation, there could lie something far more profound, if only one dared to reach out and hold on. And in that quiet desert, under twin suns that cast an endless day, they held on to each other with every intention of never letting go.